This is an art collage novel video. I made this series so you guys can experience the story faster. The video will focus on the character's psychology, the images are for illustration purposes only. Thinking of this, the fat steward couldn't help but feel hot in his heart. The mark on his palm was some kind of secret martial technique. As long as GZD was hit by it, everything would be up to him. GZD was shocked. He couldn't avoid this palm at all and could only sit and wait for death. At this moment, a sword chi suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It seemed to have calculated its position and directly cut down on the fat majordomo's head. What? The fat majordomo was shocked. If he had tried to hurt GZD, he would have been cut by the sword chi. Madame G was more important, so he hurriedly withdrew his palm power, trying to avoid the sword chi. However, what made him extremely shocked was that no matter how he dodged, he could not avoid the sword chi. What's going on? A question mark flashed in the fat majordomo's mind. Without thinking too much, he immediately unsealed the spear-shaped profound-level weapon in his hand and welcomed the attack with an imposing manner. Since he couldn't dodge to the left or right, he would fight force with force. With his strength as a 9-stars martial supreme, as long as the opponent was not a martial supreme, he would not be defeated. Bang! 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 The battle spear broke into pieces on the spot, and the sword chi swallowed the fat majordomo in an instant. A bottomless pit was blasted on the ground, and the majordomo's body was completely gone. This time, everyone was stunned on the spot. They all looked on with their mouths agape. After a few seconds, there were sounds of people taking in deep breaths. Especially the warriors of the Xian family, they were all terrified and said angrily, You've really turned the world upside down. How dare you kill my Xian family's people? Madame G was also stunned for a long time. It was not until the other party questioned her that she came back to her senses and hurriedly explained, No, we didn't do it. It was definitely not the people of my Ink Feather Merchant Association. You still dare to quibble? MOU Merchant Association is really bold. Everyone saw it with their own eyes. GZD was the first to point his sword at the general manager. Right. They can't fight us head-on, so they sent people to hide in the dark and launch a sneak attack. Damn it. The more the martial artists spoke, the angrier they became. They had been tyrants in Long Valley City for so many years, and when had they ever been taught a lesson? They were used to being arrogant. When they saw the fat manager die, they couldn't believe it. They were even more furious. If they were strong enough, they would have rushed forward and killed all the people of Ink Feather Trade Union. Madame G was completely dumbfounded. Under the repeated questioning, she felt cold all over, as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water on her and she had become a person with frostbite. Suddenly, another sword chi came from the sky. It was extremely fast and suddenly burst open in the sky. It turned into dozens of sharp blades and fell down like rain. Its target was the Xian family warriors. Not good, let's go. Only then did the Xian family warriors react. The other party had the ability and courage to kill the general director, so naturally, he could kill them in seconds. This time, all of them broke out in cold sweat. They were used to being arrogant and didn't react in time when facing danger. It was too late. The sword chi was so strong that they could not resist it no matter how hard they tried. Plop. 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 Pft. Without even making a sound, several of the martial artists' acupuncture points were directly pierced through, and they died on the spot. In the woodshed in the backyard of Ink Feather Chamber of Commerce, Yun Xiao lay half dead in the mess of firewood. He raised one hand high and pointed his index finger to the sky as he muttered to himself, The world is finally peaceful. Then, he put down his hand, turned over, and squeezed his head into the messy firewood. The dragon sighed deeply, but he was relieved. It seemed that Yun Xiao had fully recovered, but he could not face the fact that Jiang Churan and Morongju had died to save him. Everyone had a weak side, and even a peerless martial sovereign would find it difficult to bear. Madame G was awoken from her state of Lou Gehrig's disease by the scene in front of her. Her wide eyes were filled with fear and despair. You guys. The expressions of the people in the surroundings fell, and they realized that something was wrong. They quickly scattered, and the news spread. Mother, what is this good for? Although GZD was shocked, he didn't panic. He just didn't know what to do. Pa. Madam G slapped him on the spot. Her eyes were red, and she almost cried. You've caused a great disaster. Mother, I didn't kill these people. GZD covered his face and said. Of course I know, but the Xian family won't believe it, said Madam G, trembling. And these people died because of you. We will be responsible for this no matter what. After a brief moment of fear, she immediately regained a trace of calmness. After all, she had been in the business world for so many years. She grabbed GZD and said, Go quickly and find Uncle Nan at the Alchemist Association. Uncle Nan's power is enough to keep you safe. If possible, ask him to speak for us. I'm not leaving. GZD stubbornly said. Madam G stomped her feet anxiously and said angrily, You're still so insensible at a time like this. The faces of all the people from Ink Feather Merchant Association turned pale. They knew the seriousness of the matter. They had never seen Madam so flustered before. In their hearts, Madam G had always been dignified, bold, and wise. The 4 maidservants were also completely at a loss. They stood carefully beside the sedan, smelling the bloody smell on the street. Their faces were very ugly. It was obviously an expert who made a move just now, GZD said. Such an expert is usually daring. Since he dared to make a move, he is not afraid of the Xian family. He raised his head and looked up into the sky. He spread out his divine sense, but he couldn't sense anything. He could only say in a clear voice, Thank you for saving me just now, my lord. I hope my lord can offer your body. However, there was no sound in the air. GZD frowned and called out a few times, but there was still no response. Madam G also hoped that someone would take on the responsibility, but her heart continued to sink. Long Valley City was one of the main cities in the eastern region, and the Xian family and the Shui family were the 2 major forces that controlled the city. There were many martial supremes in the family, as well as various powerhouses who had gathered from all over the world. No one dared to offend them. The person who launched the sneak attack had probably already escaped. ZD, just listen to your mother this time. This time, we've really caused a big disaster. If we don't handle it well, the business of Ink Feather Trade Union for many years will be destroyed. Madam G began to plead, You only know how to cultivate in seclusion, and you don't know how dangerous the world is. Now, only by relying on Uncle Nan's identity as an alchemist can we have a chance to turn things around. If you don't go to Uncle Nan, not only the whole of Ink Feather Trade Union, but I'm afraid I will also be buried with him. Can you bear to see me die? Madam G knew that her son had always been kind and genuine. If she forced him to escape, he would definitely not agree, so she deliberately hit his weakness. Sure enough, GZD's expression changed drastically, and he said solemnly, Mother, please wait for me here. I'll go get Uncle Nan. Young master, I'll go with you. Hongshan suddenly walked out and said. She could also tell that the experts of the Xian family would soon come to kill them, and the Alchemist Association was the only way to survive. So, she stood out boldly. How could Madam G not understand her thoughts? She snorted coldly and said, You stay here. When second young master Xian comes, I'll have to rely on you guys to calm him down. Hongshan's face turned pale in an instant, knowing that her plan had failed. Don't worry, everyone, GZD said. I'll invite Uncle Nan here soon. With Uncle Nan's status, he'll definitely be able to mediate this matter. He immediately turned into a beam of light and headed toward the Alchemist Association in Long Valley City. The Alchemist Association was spread all over the continent and enjoyed a high reputation and prestige everywhere. Everyone had to show some respect to it. Bang! Suddenly, a loud noise came from the sky. Everyone hurriedly looked up and saw a trail of blood in the sky. GZD's body fell directly to the ground and coughed up blood. He struggled, his eyes full of fear and anger. ZD. Madame G screamed and quickly went to help her son up. She immediately took out a scarlet pill and fed it to him. Humph, you want to leave after killing my Xian family's people? A cold intent came from the sky, and then a ball of light slowly appeared. It circled in the sky a few times before landing on the ground, revealing several figures. Second young master. Madame G's face instantly turned pale. She hurriedly protected her son behind her, her eyes full of despair. The people who appeared all had cold and mocking expressions. In the middle was an ugly man with a flat face and protruding eyes. He sat on a throne and his eyes flashed with viciousness as he said coldly, "Madame G, you're very bold." Madame G's body couldn't help but shiver. With a sobbing tone, she said, "I hope that second young master can investigate this matter thoroughly. We definitely didn't kill that Lord General Manager. We don't have the guts, and even if we do, we don't have the strength." Humph, you don't have the guts? It seems that hundreds of people saw your son draw his sword first, and the manager was killed by the sword chi in the fight. You're really too humble to be so bold. A warrior behind Xian Tongtong coldly rebuked as a vicious smile appeared on his face. Xian Tongtong crossed his legs lazily and said impatiently, "A few days ago, I had a good conversation with Madame G. I thought Madame G was someone who could see the big picture, but now, it has completely changed my impression of you. If you want to start a war with my Xian family, I will accompany you at any time." Madame G's entire body trembled and she was startled, but a trace of joy surged up in her heart. Hearing Xian Tongtong's tone, today's matter did not seem to be as bad as she had imagined, and perhaps there was still room for reconciliation. She hurriedly said, "Second young master, you must investigate thoroughly. The Ink Feather Trade Union has no intention of offending the Xian family. Although today's matter was not done by the Ink Feather Trade Union, it was indeed caused by us. Please tell us how to deal with it. We will accept it with great care and no complaints." Oh. Xian Tongtong's lips curled into a playful smile as he said, "Madame G is indeed a straightforward person, and I, Xian Tongtong, am not an unreasonable person. Moreover, the dead can't be resurrected, so it's useless to pursue the matter. I'll just compensate you with some compensation." Madame G was stunned. She didn't expect the other party to be so easy to talk to. She couldn't believe it and said, "Second young master is magnanimous. May I know how much the compensation is?" Her heart was filled with apprehension. If the other party simply stated an astronomical figure, then Ink Feather Merchant Association would go bankrupt. Before the final agreement was out, she did not look relaxed at all. Xian Tongtong's eyes glowed with lust as he looked at Xiling and the other maidservants. "First of all, I want 20 virgins of this level of beauty and cultivation." The 4 maidservants' faces were deathly pale, and their eyes were filled with despair. "This?" Madame G was stunned for a moment and said, "The 4 of them are the only maidservants in Ink Feather Chamber of Commerce who have reached the cultivation level of martial lords. There are some who are as beautiful as them. Can you lower your standards?" Impudent. One of the experts behind Xian Tongtong shouted angrily, "Second young master is already very magnanimous and has done his best. You guys don't know what's good for you and even dare to negotiate with him." Madame G's heart trembled as she was scolded. She hurriedly said, "I don't dare, I definitely don't dare. I will definitely find a way to do it. Second young master, please give me a little more time." As for the rest of the beautiful female servants with the cultivation base of martial lords, she could only spend a lot of money to buy them. She knew that there was a way to buy such beautiful women with a certain cultivation base, but they would all cost a fortune. But at this moment, she could not care less. "Yes, that's a good girl." Xian Tongtong's lips curled into a mocking smile as he stared at Madame G and sized her up without any restraint, causing Madame G's mind to be thrown into chaos and panic. "As for the second condition, it's for Madame G to come back with me and let me have a taste." "What?" Everyone in Ink Feather Merchant House was shocked. Madame G was even more so, as if she had been struck by lightning, and she almost lost her balance. Behind him, GZD almost spat out a mouthful of blood in anger. He let out a furious roar and was about to rush forward to fight for his life, but he was forcefully held down by the two cultivators from the Chamber of Commerce. I've played with too many of these little girls, but I've rarely used a mature woman like Madame G who still has her charm and elegance. Xian Tongtong grinned hideously. The cultivators behind him also laughed wildly, their eyes sweeping across Madame G's body without restraint. Madame G felt the world was spinning around her, and her face turned purple. She was teased in front of so many people, and she even wanted to die. She knew that she would not be able to escape today's incident. It seemed that the other party had already planned to swallow her Chamber of Commerce. It was ridiculous that she still had to lower herself to cater to the other party. It was ridiculous. Madame is no longer a teenager. How can she meet young master's appetite? Let Ziling serve young master. I guarantee that young master will be satisfied. I only hope that young master can be magnanimous and let Madame and the Ink Feather Merchant Association off. Just as all the ridicule were heard, Ziling slowly walked out and nodded, forcing a smile on her face. She was extremely nervous, but she had already made plans to repay the kindness of Madame G's upbringing. Madame G was still dizzy at the moment, and she looked at Ziling in shock and gratitude. We'll only know if it's to our liking after eating it. If it's not to our liking, we can just give it to our subordinates to use. Xian Tongtong sneered and looked at Ziling, but I'm still quite interested in you. I've had countless women, so what makes you think you can guarantee that I'll be satisfied? Ziling's face was red and purple, but she still gathered her courage and said, I've learned many secret techniques. I'm sure young master will be satisfied. Xian Tongtong laughed cruelly and said, Good. I like the active type like you. How about this, let everyone test and see if you can really satisfy me. Take off all your clothes now, then kneel on the ground and crawl over. Try to satisfy this young master with your little mouth. What? Ziling's body trembled, and her tears finally gushed out. She almost fainted. What's wrong? Not willing? Then why would this young master be satisfied? The flesh on Xian Tongtong's toad-like face immediately scrunched up as he snorted, If you don't want to, then let your madam do it. He waved his hand, and a martial artist behind him walked toward Madame G with a sinister smile. Madame G screamed in fear and retreated, looking so helpless. Stop. Quickly stop. I'm willing, let me do it, let Madame go. Ziling sobbed loudly. In the blink of an eye, she became a tearful person. Under everyone's gaze, her whole body trembled, like 100 spirits in the wind, about to wither at any time. The people around them had different expressions. The warriors of Ink Feather Trade Union all lowered their heads in shame, but some people looked at each other coldly with lustful expressions and bright eyes. Hurry up if you're willing, Xian Tongtong sneered, my patience is limited. Ziling bit her lips until they bled. Her body trembled violently, but the look in her eyes became more and more determined as she untied the belt around her waist. Yo, you're really bold. You're indeed a trained slut. The martial artists behind Xian Tongtong laughed evilly. All kinds of ridicule and sneers came. Ziling only felt that the world was spinning and she could not stand still. But when she thought of the lady, the young master, and the Ink Feather Merchant Association, she immediately gritted her teeth and began to take off her clothes. Xian Tongtong licked his lips and erected a tent below him. He laughed lecherously and said, You're too slow, let this young master help you. He slapped his palm, and a gust of cold wind gathered and shook towards Ziling. He intended to directly shatter her clothes. That scene must be very beautiful. Ziling's face was full of tears. She closed her eyes, and her body trembled violently. She looked at the palm in despair. All of a sudden, the power of the Yin wind dissipated without any warning, blowing away without a trace. Ziling stood there, trembling. Even the corner of her clothes did not flutter. At the same time, an apathetic voice was heard, All right, you can die now. The voice was so cold that it didn't sound like it came from a human's mouth. Who is it? Xian Tongtong was shocked and shouted. He suddenly discovered that not far away, beside the wedding sedan, a man had unknowingly stood there. This man had his arms crossed in front of his chest and his entire body was leaning against the wedding sedan, giving off a feeling of powerlessness. The strangest thing was that he actually made a wooden frame and covered his neck with it, hiding his entire head inside. Xian Tongtong did not dare to be careless. He had also heard about the fat steward's death and knew that the person who had killed him was extremely powerful. It was very likely that he was already a marshal supreme. Although the person in front of him was strange, it was highly possible that he was the murderer of the fat steward. He composed himself and shouted coldly, "Who exactly are you? Using a wooden frame to cover your head, are you afraid that the Xian family will recognize you and take revenge?" If he couldn't afford to offend them, why would he? Aren't you asking for it? The man seemed to sigh deeply and said in a disappointed voice, "You're thinking too much. I used the wooden frame to cover my head because I felt too embarrassed to face anyone. I didn't know how to face them, so I sealed my head. I felt that I was cute this way." Excuses. No one in the world can save you now that you've killed someone from the Xian family of Long Valley City. Xian Tongtong soon realized that the other party was not a martial emperor. He was instantly relieved. A cold glint flashed across his eyes as he said softly, "Kill." The martial artists behind him immediately roared and rushed forward. They were all martial honorables and were extremely fast. They spread out in all directions and stacked their domains, immediately locking the man in place. Clang. Suddenly, a ray of cold light shot out, directly reflecting the sunlight, stinging everyone's eyes. Xian Tongtong could not help but close his eyes. Arg.
Ah. Ah.
In an instant, countless screams could be heard. Under the sword, all the martial supremes who had rushed forward were cut in half. They fell to the ground and did not die. They struggled and twitched in pain. A few of them were even wailing, "Young master, save me." It was a terrifying sight. The sudden change stunned everyone, but Madame Ji also calmed down and hurriedly ordered a warrior beside her to go to the Alchemist Association and ask Uncle Nan to take charge of the situation. After her grief, Ziling looked at the man with tears on her face, as if she had recognized him as Yun Xiao. However, the man's head was covered with a wooden frame, and he was so powerful that she could not confirm her thoughts. Xian Tongtong was taken aback. He had only closed his eyes slightly, so he did not see how Yun Xiao had attacked. Yun Xiao was still leaning weakly against the sedan chair with his arms crossed, looking haggard. The two remaining experts of the Xian family looked at each other and saw the seriousness in each other's eyes. Xian Tongting's face also darkened as he said coldly, "As expected, you're a real person. You're actually a martial sovereign of the 9 heavens." Yun Xiao only had the cultivation base of a peak 9 stars martial supreme at the moment, but the power of his attack just now had exceeded the realm of a martial supreme, so Xian Tongtong had mistaken him for a martial emperor. Everyone was shocked and overwhelmed with shock. The people from Ink Feather Trade Union could not understand why a martial emperor would offend the Xian family just to help them. Madame Ji quickly tried to recall the man's name, but she could not find him. When her eyes inadvertently swept over Ziling, who was shocked, she was startled. As if she had thought of something, she quickly turned to Yun Xiao, and her face changed. Madame Ji was an existence who had seen countless people, and her eyes were very sharp. After thinking for a moment, she immediately recognized Yun Xiao's identity. It was the young man who was seriously injured and put in the woodshed by Ziling. He was actually a martial sovereign of the 9 heavens?